It's April 21st. I hope you're not getting too stir crazy from the lockdown and that you're staying safe. So, this is going to be a short lecture on uh, what the what the Fed or other central bank should do with its interest rate policy. So the Fed actually has other duties besides interest rate policy, but interest rate policy is the core of what it does in terms of monetary policy. And just to remind you, uh, you might want to review the online lecture about how interest rate cuts stimulate the economy. We had all the borrower-lender relationships. In each of those relationships, uh, the what's an interest rate cut that's bad for the lender is good for the borrower. So we have countervailing wealth effects, but lenders are not as good at spending as borrowers. So shifting the balance of power towards the borrowers leads to more total spending, even before you add in the incentive effect. Uh, lower interest rates make it in effect cheaper to spend now relative to spending later, and that tends to increase the spending of everybody. But the wealth effects are lead to more spending on the part of borrowers, less spending on the part of lenders. Through that effect, the incentive effects go the same way for everybody. So that's going to give us the effective interest rate cuts on aggregate demand. There's also this effect on net exports, which we'll talk a lot more about very soon in relation to the short-run international finance diagram. But let's talk about just what you want to do with that, what you should do with that power to increase the aggregate demand by interest rate cuts, or reduce aggregate demand by increasing interest rates. Okay, so first of all, we need to understand how this fits in to the whole system. So let me draw the following diagram here. So we've got the different components of aggregate demand: consumption, investment, government purchases. Then we also have net exports. Now, we will be talking a lot in the short-run international finance diagram about investment and net exports, and then we have government purchases here as well. Interest rate cuts make all of these go up. These because of the borrower-lender relationships, and of course the government is part of borrower-lender relationships too. And then net exports increases because of another mechanism, that lower interest rates cause capital outflows. We'll talk about that more in relation to international finance. So the mechanism for net exports is different, but interest rate cuts increase all of these. So these are components of aggregate demand. So I'll have a arrow here with a plus sign, because aggregate demand goes up when any of these things goes up. And here, when I talk about aggregate demand, I'm really talking about intentional investment. As you know from chapter 10, there can be temporary departures from where investment is away from intentional investment because of inventory investment, piling up of goods that you thought you could sell but you can't, or inventory disinvestment when you run out of a good that is selling really quickly and you wish you'd gotten more of that, but instead you underestimated the demand. So aggregate demand, once you have intentional investment equal to actual investment, aggregate demand is equal to GDP. So there's an adjustment process there, but it's a very fast adjustment process of unintentional inventory investment getting undone. You know, if you have too many goods on the store shelves, then you order fewer. If you have too few goods on the store shelves, then you order more. So there's a quite quick adjustment process that makes overall GDP equal to aggregate demand. Now, one of the really important things you need to remember is that higher GDP also means higher income for people. GDP has many different aspects to it, and one aspect of it is income for people, and higher income leads to more consumption. So this is a positive feedback loop. If you multiply the plus signs around, if you think of positive numbers here, and you multiply them around, you get a positive number. So that's a positive feedback loop. And in fact, this is a very famous positive feedback loop. This positive feedback loop here is called the Keynesian multiplier. That's the name of that positive feedback loop. Okay, so you've got this Keynesian multiplier. So if we have any change in desired investment, government purchases, or net exports, that's going to increase aggregate demand and therefore increase GDP in the short run. And then there are second and third and fourth round effects as you go around this positive feedback loop, this Keynesian multiplier. So aggregate demand is going to move in the same direction as I plus G plus NX. It'll just move more than I plus G plus NX because you have these additional rounds of effects. So when I talk about adjusting aggregate demand or changes in aggregate demand, I'm going to focus on I, G, and X because consumption just makes things go further. Now, if you had some change that started with consumption, then that would raise aggregate demand, and then it would have further rounds effects too. But so we could have that kind of a shock to aggregate demand. But I'm gonna especially focus on I, G, and NX. But we could distinguish the sometimes called the autonomous part of C. These autonomous things that get started before GDP changes, and then you have the second and third and fourth round effects. Okay, so remember again, lower interest rates can cause some autonomous change in C. It can cause an autonomous change in I, certainly. Can cause an autonomous change in G as lower interest rates reduce the measured government budget deficit, so the government feels like it can spend more. And then net exports because of the effect on capital flows. Okay, so this is what's going on. When we go to the international finance diagram, we're going to especially have on the graphs investment and net exports. So there we'll be focusing on I plus NX, and G will be in the background, but it'll still be there. Okay, so what should the Fed be doing with this power? Try to adjust that a little bit. Oh boy. Okay, so what should the Fed be doing with this power that it has? Well, in chapter 10 of ManQ, you've got, in chapters 10 of ManQ, he has a long run aggregate supply curve and a short run aggregate supply curve, which is simply what prices are sticky at. We've got prices on this axis and GDP on that axis. And then there's an aggregate demand curve. And the simple answer to what the Fed should be doing is to have its aggregate demand curve go right through that intersection of long-run aggregate supply and short-run aggregate supply. Now, I'm going to make things even simpler by just focusing in on this aggregate demand, this quantity dimension. And so, the price is sticky, it doesn't move very fast, so we actually don't need to focus on that in the graph. Let's go on to just focus on the that one dimension of quantity. So what we have here is that level of output at which you have the long-run aggregate supply curve, that vertical level, is called the natural level of output. So this is going to look like a number line in a minute. Okay, so I've got this natural level of output, or GDP, right here on my number line. And the job of interest rate policy, which is the single most important job of a central bank, or the single most basic job of a central bank, is to get aggregate demand to be on top of this natural level of output. So make the quantity of aggregate demand equal to that. So this is the job of interest rate policy. Make the quantity of aggregate demand equal to the natural level of output. And let's give this a symbol. We'll call this YN here. That's just symbol for natural level of output. Okay. So how does it do that? Well, if aggregate demand is ever over here, raise interest rates. If aggregate demand is ever over here, cut interest rates until you get aggregate demand equal to the natural level of output. Now, in terms of adjusting things, what would you have to do? Suppose you do have the level of aggregate demand equal to the natural level of output. What could disturb things? Well, one thing is the natural level of output could go up. Okay, so what if we wind up with yn prime up here? Well, now you've got a higher natural level of output, and you need to adjust aggregate demand upwards. How do you do that? You cut rates. So why would the natural level of aggregate demand go up? Well, the natural level of output is equal to, let's use Cobb-Douglas, it's equal to the level of technology times the amount of capital to the alpha times the natural level of employment. So maybe I'll put a little n here, the natural level of employment to the 1 minus alpha. Okay, so other than this concept of the natural level of employment, where this should be very familiar here. So if technology improves, the natural level of output goes up, the Fed needs to cut rates. If capital stock will change very slowly, so that certainly goes into figuring out the natural level of output, but there's not going to be a sudden shock to that, short of a bunch of factories being bombed and destroyed by that. And then you have worse problems than just worrying about monetary policy, though you still have to worry about monetary policy. And then I should say this natural level of the employment of labor hours really is determined by two things. It's determined by population, and it's determined by those three wedges that we talked about. Okay, so this natural level of output, so ln depends on, certainly it depends on the population, and it depends on the desired markup, which was price elasticity of demand over price elasticity of demand minus 1. Then it depends on marginal tax rates. And it depends on labor market imperfections, which of course are the least well understood, but I have talked about them quite a bit to the extent that I understand anything about them. So what could possibly change the natural level of output? Improvements in technology. And the key thing there is not when something is invented, but when it comes into wide use. So some technology coming into wide use could change the natural level of output. A change in the population, you might have a lot of immigration, or a change in the desired markup or marginal tax rates or labor market imperfections could change the natural level of output. And then of course, we've talked a lot when we did growth theory about, in chapters 8 and 9, about very long run changes in the capital stock. So that can be important, but it's pretty slow. The key thing there is the level of investment in factories and machines, certainly, and actually the investment in research and development, which can affect the technology in the long run, in addition to these more sudden changes that come because of the adoption of new technologies. How many new technologies you get, or how good they are, does depend on research and development in the very long run, although some things are invented by people who weren't looking for them. So it's not always intentional research and development that gives you better technology. Sometimes it's dumb luck or serendipity, but sometimes it is from intentional research and development. Okay, so if this happens, if A went up, if somehow the natural level of employment went up, and actually in addition to these things that affect the natural level of employment, I realize I should add that there are just people's desire to work added. You know, there can be cultural changes. There's certainly demographic changes. When we talk about population, it matters just how old people are, how much they want to work. But you can have, there actually are some changes in how much people want to work that we don't fully understand. You can make up stories. You know, one story that has made the rounds among economists is video games have gotten really good. If video games are really wonderful, then you want to stay home and play video games instead of work, so that would reduce the desire to work. You know, that probably has some effect. I'm not sure that it's that huge. Okay, so one of the shocks, backing up, one of the kinds of shocks that would require the Fed to adjust aggregate demand is an increase in the natural level of output. Okay, now let's leave that story to one side, just ignore all this. The other thing that could happen is that the natural level of output stays the same, but there's some other shock that changes aggregate demand. Well, then it's really easy. Just bring the aggregate demand back to here. So unless the natural level of output changes, what we want to do is cancel out any changes in aggregate demand. And we'll talk a lot about that when we do the international finance diagrams too. But if technology improves, if somehow you have a reduction in one of the wedges, or an increase for that matter, if somehow the desire to work changes or the population changes, then you need to change interest rates to have aggregate demand match that natural level of output. But otherwise, it's just undo any shocks to aggregate demand. If something makes aggregate demand change, undo that. Make aggregate demand go back to where it was. So if we don't have this change, we just want to stay there. And what could happen to disturb things? Well, let's go back to the components of aggregate demand. If there's some autonomous change in C that makes C go up and then you get some later round effects, then you have to raise interest rates. If there's some autonomous thing that makes investment go up, then you got to raise interest rates. And similarly for these, if there's some autonomous thing that makes one of these go down, you got to cut interest rates. Do whatever you have to with interest rates to get aggregate demand back to where it was. And of course you can, because you have some very powerful forces that allow you, with a big enough interest rate cut, to get aggregate demand to whatever it needs to be. There is no limit to the power of interest rate changes to get aggregate demand to where it needs to be if you have an even halfway functioning economy. A post-apocalyptic stuff, that's different. But these are very powerful forces. Sometimes people claim falsely that there's a limit to what interest rate cuts can do. There is no limit, partly because there's no limit to how low you can make interest rates go, and there's no limit to how high you can make interest rates go in order to get aggregate demand to do what it should do. And what it should do is to match the natural level of output. Well, thanks for listening to me, and stay safe.